Some truths are not buried because they are weak, but because they would destroy the people who hid them. The door locked with a quiet click that echoed longer than it should have, as if the stone walls themselves remembered every time it had been closed on her. Eliza Whitmore stood in the dim light of a single trembling candle, its flame bending with each breath she dared to take. The small room, no larger than 8 by 10 feet, held no mirrors, no portraits, nothing that could prove she existed beyond the silence imposed upon her. Below her, the grand halls of Whitmore Estate breathed with life. Laughter drifting faintly through the floorboards, the clinking of crystal glasses, the distant music of a string quartet carried through the corridors she was forbidden to walk. In that house, she was not a daughter, not a guest, not even a servant. She was an absence carefully maintained, a secret sealed behind polished doors and whispered lies. And yet she stood straight, hands folded gently before her, as though dignity could not be taken even when everything else had been stripped away. Miles away, beneath a sky heavy with gathering storm clouds, Duke Alexander Ravenscroft rode toward the estate, his black coat catching the wind, his expression unreadable as the carriage wheels crushed gravel beneath their weight. He was not a man easily moved, not by rumors, not by desperation, not by the carefully arranged smiles of noble families seeking his favor. He came because an arrangement had been made, a union of names and fortunes, nothing more, nothing he intended to question. Yet, the moment he stepped into the Whitmore estate, something unseen shifted. The air carried a tension too quiet to be named. Servants lowered their eyes too quickly. Conversations died too abruptly. And somewhere deep within the stone corridors, beyond the reach of candlelight, a presence lingered, unnoticed by all but him. That night, long after the music had faded and the guests had retired, Alexander walked the corridor alone. His footsteps measured, deliberate, until a sound stopped him. Not loud, not desperate, but unmistakably human. A voice, soft and steady, speaking into the darkness. As if refusing to be erased, he followed it without thinking, past the doors no guest was meant to see, until he stood before one that did not belong, the handle cold beneath his gloved hand, locked from the outside. His jaw tightened, and for the first time in years, something stirred beneath his carefully controlled exterior. Not curiosity, not yet, but recognition. As if somewhere behind that door was not a secret meant to be hidden, but a truth waiting to be seen, and without fully understanding why, he did not walk away. The lock did not yield at first, as though even the metal had learned obedience. But Alexander did not step back, his fingers tightening around the handle before he spoke, his voice low and steady, not raised, not demanding, simply present. Who is inside? The silence that followed was not empty. It held breath, hesitation, and something else that did not belong to fear. Then at last her voice came again, closer now, calm in a way that unsettled him more than any plea could have. Someone who was not meant to be heard. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus, as if each word she chose mattered more than she intended. That is not an answer, he replied, and for a moment he considered leaving, because this was not his concern, because the house was not his, because whatever was hidden behind that door had been hidden deliberately. Yet something in the quiet dignity of her tone held him there. I have no answer that would be acceptable to you, she said, and there was no bitterness in it, only a quiet acceptance that made the corridor feel colder. Alexander exhaled slowly, his breath barely visible in the dim light. Acceptable is not the same as truthful, he said, and this time there was a pause that stretched longer, as if the truth itself required permission to exist. Footsteps approached from the other side, soft against the floor, until they stopped just beyond the door, close enough that he could sense her presence. Without seeing her, I was told not to speak when others are near, she said at last, and something in the phrasing made his jaw tighten. Not ordered, not instructed, told, as if the command had been repeated so often it had become part of her. Who told you that? He asked, but even as he spoke he heard movement at the far end of the corridor, a servant approaching, too quickly, too deliberately. Your Grace, the voice came, breath slightly uneven, as though the man had hurried. You should not be here. Alexander did not turn immediately, his gaze fixed on the door as if he could see through it. And why is that? He asked, his tone unchanged. The servant hesitated, searching for an answer that would satisfy without revealing too much. This wing isn't used. It is not prepared for guests, and used, Alexander repeated softly. And yet there is a locked door, and someone inside who has been told not to speak. The servant lowered his eyes. Your Grace, I assure you, it is nothing that requires your attention. Nothing, Alexander echoed. And finally he turned, his expression composed but no longer indifferent. I have found that the things most often called nothing are the ones carefully hidden. The servant swallowed, clearly uncomfortable, and for the first time since arriving at the estate, Alexander felt something sharper than curiosity take hold. Not anger, not yet, but a quiet refusal to accept what was being presented to him. He looked back at the door, then again at the servant. Have this unlocked, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a command that did not need to be raised. The servant froze. Your Grace, I cannot. The key is not in my possession. Then find who holds it, Alexander replied, without hesitation, and bring it to me, because I do not leave doors closed when I know there is someone behind them. And as silence settled once more over the corridor, the presence behind the door did not retreat, did not move away, as if for the first time in years, she had chosen to remain where she could be heard. The corridor did not return to silence after the servant hurried away. It held a tension that seemed to breathe between the stone walls, as though the house itself was waiting to see whether the Duke would truly remain, and Alexander did remain, unmoving before the locked door, his presence no longer casual but deliberate, the kind that altered the air around it. Inside the room, Eliza stood just as still, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the small wooden table as if grounding herself in something real. She had heard promises before, heard voices that came close only to disappear again. But this was different, not louder, not kinder, simply unwavering, and that alone felt dangerous in a way she could not name. You should not stay, she said quietly through the door, her voice steady but softer now, not from fear, but from something closer to caution. He did not answer. Immediately, his gaze fixed on the iron lock as if measuring more than its strength. I was not told what I should or should not do, he replied at last, and there was something in his tone that carried more than authority. It carried decision. That is precisely why you should leave, she said, and for the first time there was a faint shift beneath her calm, not quite urgency, but awareness of consequence. If you remain, they will not forgive you. Alexander's expression did not change. Forgiveness is not something I require from strangers, he said, and the words settled between them with a quiet finality. Footsteps returned at last, quicker this time, heavier, accompanied by another set that moved with practiced control, a man of higher standing. Older, his voice composed but strained beneath the surface. Your Grace, there must be some misunderstanding. The master of the house stepped forward, offering a polite incline of his head that did not quite reach his eyes. This part of the estate is not prepared for visitors, and yet it has been prepared well enough to hold someone inside, Alexander replied, his voice even, the calm precision of it leaving little room for argument. The older man hesitated, then forced a thin smile. You honor us with your concern, but I assure you, this is a private family matter, and I assure you, Alexander said, turning fully to face him now, that I do not ignore what is placed directly before me. The silence that followed was heavier than before. The servant standing behind his master kept his gaze lowered, as if unwilling to witness what might come next. Inside the room, Eliza closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in despair, but in quiet acceptance that whatever was about to unfold could no longer be contained. The master of the house straightened slightly, attempting to reclaim control. Your Grace, this arrangement you have come for. It would be most unfortunate if unnecessary complications were to arise. The implication was clear, a warning wrapped in politeness. Alexander regarded him without expression, then spoke with measured clarity. If an arrangement depends on silence about what is clearly wrong, then it is not an arrangement I intend to keep. The words landed with quiet force, leaving no room for negotiation. The older man's composure faltered for the briefest second before returning, and in that small fracture, something was revealed, not the full truth, but enough to confirm what had already begun to take shape in Alexander's mind. The door was not locked to protect what was inside, it was locked to hide it. And as that realization settled, the distance between him and the truth grew smaller, not because the door had opened, but because he had chosen not to walk away. The tension in the corridor did not break. It deepened, settling into something colder and far more dangerous than raised voices, because nothing more was said for several seconds. And in that silence, the truth pressed closer to the surface. Alexander did not move, his gaze steady on the man before him, while the older gentleman adjusted his cuffs with controlled precision, as though small gestures could restore authority that had already begun to slip. "You place yourself in an uncomfortable position, Your Grace," the man said at last, his tone carefully measured. "This house has its rules, and those rules have been respected for many years." Alexander's expression remained unchanged. "Then it is time they are questioned," he replied, and there was no defiance in his voice, only certainty, the kind that did not seek permission. Behind the door, Eliza's fingers tightened slightly against the wood, not from fear, but from recognition that something irreversible had begun. She had lived within limits so long that the idea of those limits breaking did not feel like freedom. It felt like the edge of something unknown. "You do not understand what you are interfering with," the older man continued, his composure thinning just enough to reveal strain beneath it. "There are matters of reputation, of legacy, of consequence," words that had likely been repeated often enough to justify everything that had been done. Alexander regarded him quietly, then spoke with deliberate clarity. "Reputation built on silence is not something I consider worth preserving." The statement did not rise in volume, yet it carried through the corridor with more force than any raised voice could have. The servant standing behind the master shifted uneasily, as if caught between obedience and awareness. Inside the room, Eliza exhaled slowly, her breath steadying as she rested her hand against the door. For years she had been spoken about, never spoken to, and now, for the first time, someone stood on the other side, not to enforce her absence, but to challenge it. The master of the house straightened, his posture sharpening as he made one final attempt to regain control. "You have come here for an alliance," he said, his voice quieter now, edged with warning. "I would advise you not to jeopardize it for something that does not concern you." Alexander's gaze did not waver. "Everything that is deliberately hidden concerns me," he said, and with that the last pretense fell away. The older man's lips pressed into a thin line, his silence confirming more than any admission could have. The door was no longer just a boundary, it was a decision. And Alexander turned back to it fully, his gloved hand resting once more against the cold metal of the lock. "You may choose to keep it closed," he said, not looking back, "but understand this. I will not remain in a house where someone is kept as though they do not exist." The words settled with quiet finality, leaving no room for compromise. Inside, Eliza closed her eyes for a brief moment, her heartbeat steady, not racing, not faltering, because for the first time, the world beyond the door did not feel entirely unreachable. Footsteps echoed again down the corridor, heavier this time, more urgent, and the faint sound of metal against metal followed. The key, at last, approaching, and as that sound drew closer, something shifted in the space between them. Not hope, not yet, but the undeniable sense that the silence that had defined her life was about to be broken. The sound of the key did not rush. It approached with a measured inevitability that made every second stretch longer than it should, until at last the servant returned, his hand slightly unsteady as he held out the iron key toward his master. The older man hesitated only for a fraction of a moment before taking it, his fingers tightening around the metal as if it carried more weight than it appeared. "This is unnecessary," he said quietly, though the certainty in his voice had thinned into something closer to resistance than authority. Alexander did not respond. He did not need to. His silence now carried expectation, not request, and that alone shifted the balance of the moment. The older man turned toward the door, his movements precise but no longer controlled in the same effortless way, as if each step required decision. The key met the lock with a dull metallic click, and for a brief second, no one moved, as though the house itself held its breath. Then the lock turned, slow, deliberate, the sound echoing down the corridor like something long denied finally giving way. Inside the room, Eliza did not step back. She did not retreat into the shadows that had once been her only refuge. Instead, she stood where she was, her posture straight, her chin lifted just enough to meet whatever would come, because if the door opened, she would not greet the world as something hidden, but as someone who had endured it. The handle turned, and the door opened inward, not with force, not with drama, but with a quiet finality that made it impossible to ignore. The light from the corridor slipped into the room, soft at first, then steady, touching the edges of a space that had not been meant to be seen. Alexander stepped forward, just one step, enough to cross the threshold without fully entering, and for the first time, he saw her, not as a voice behind wood and iron, but as a presence that filled the space without effort. She stood near the small table, her dress simple but carefully kept, her posture composed. Her gaze steady as it met his without hesitation. There was no fear in it, no pleading, only a quiet awareness of being seen, and that alone made something shift within him, not surprise, but recognition, because nothing about her aligned with the way she had been hidden. Nothing about her justified the silence that had surrounded her existence. Behind him, the older man spoke quickly, as if needing to reclaim control of what had already begun to unravel. Your Grace, this is precisely what I wish to avoid. There are matters you do not understand. But Alexander did not look away from her. Then I suggest you begin explaining them, he said, his voice calm, unhurried, yet carrying a weight that left no space for evasion. Eliza remained still, though her breath slowed almost imperceptibly, because this moment, this simple act of a door opening, had already changed something fundamental, not in the world beyond, not yet, but within the space where she had been confined. She was no longer unseen, and as the silence settled once more, it was no longer the silence of absence, but the silence before something begins. For a moment, no one spoke, because the truth did not arrive with noise. It settled quietly in the space between them, undeniable and exposed. Alexander remained where he stood at the threshold, not crossing fully into the room, not retreating, as if he understood instinctively that this space, though small and hidden, had been the only place she had ever possessed, and he would not take even that from her without invitation. Eliza held his gaze without lowering her eyes, her composure unshaken, though something within her shifted, not fear, but the unfamiliar weight of being acknowledged. She had expected judgment, dismissal, perhaps even indifference, but not this stillness, not this measured attention that did not attempt to define her before understanding her. You have been kept here, Alexander said at last, his voice low, not a question, but an observation that carried no accusation toward her, only toward the circumstances that had shaped this moment. Eliza inclined her head slightly, as if accepting the statement without needing to confirm it. I have been placed where I was meant to be unseen, she replied, her tone calm, the words chosen with care, not out of fear, but out of long habit. Behind him, the older man stepped forward, his voice sharper now, controlled but edged with urgency. This situation has been managed appropriately for years, Your Grace. It does not require your intervention. Alexander did not turn, his focus remained on her, and that alone seemed to unsettle the man more than any direct challenge could have. Appropriately, Alexander repeated, his tone thoughtful, as though testing the word itself. Then he allowed a brief pause before continuing. I have found that when something must be hidden this carefully, it is rarely because it has been handled well. The silence that followed carried weight, not raised voices, not argument, but the quiet dismantling of a narrative that had held for too long. Eliza's hands remained still at her sides, though her fingers relaxed slightly, the tension she had carried for years, easing in a way she did not fully understand, because this was not rescue, not yet, it was recognition, and that alone felt like something she had never been permitted to have. The older man exhaled slowly, his composure returning in fragments. You do not know who she is, he said, his voice lowering, as if the truth itself required discretion, and you assume that justifies this, Alexander replied, finally turning his head just enough for his words to reach him without breaking the connection he held with her presence. There are reasons, the man insisted, reputation, consequences that extend beyond this house. Words that had been used before, repeated until they sounded like truth. Eliza closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in refusal, but in quiet acceptance of what was about to be said. because she had heard those reasons her entire life. They had been the foundation of her existence, and yet now, spoken aloud in this space, they felt smaller, less certain. Alexander regarded the man with calm clarity, then spoke with deliberate precision. If the explanation requires her to remain hidden, then it is not one I am willing to accept. The statement settled with finality, leaving no space for compromise. Eliza opened her eyes again, her gaze steady, and for the first time, something unspoken passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but the recognition that the silence that had defined her life was no longer absolute. And as the candlelight flickered softly against the walls, the room no longer felt like a place meant to contain her, but a place she was already beginning to leave behind. The room did not feel the same once the truth had been spoken aloud, not fully revealed, but no longer entirely hidden, and that shift, subtle as it was, changed the way the air settled around them. Alexander remained at the threshold for a moment longer before stepping inside at last, not with force, not with intrusion, but with quiet intention, as though crossing into her space required more than authority. It required acknowledgement. Eliza did not move to retreat. She did not step back into the dim corners that had once defined her world. Instead, she stood where she was, allowing the distance between them to close naturally, her gaze steady, her posture composed, because if she was to be seen, it would not be as something diminished. "Who are you?" Alexander asked, and this time it was not directed at the circumstances, not at the hidden structure of the house, but at her. The question simple, yet carrying a weight that no one had ever granted her before. Eliza held his gaze for a brief moment before answering, as though choosing not only her words, but the right to speak them. "I was given a name," she said quietly, "but it was not one I was permitted to use beyond these walls." The answer was not defiant, not bitter, but it carried something deeper than either, a quiet truth shaped by years of silence. Alexander studied her, not as one might observe a curiosity, but as one might recognize something that had been deliberately overlooked. "And what name would you choose to use now?" he asked, the question deliberate, offering not assumption, but choice. Something she had never been given. Eliza's breath slowed, her fingers loosening at her sides as if releasing something unseen. "Eliza Whitmore," she said, her voice steady, the name spoken not loudly, but with a quiet certainty that filled the room more than any raised tone could have. Behind them, the older man stiffened almost imperceptibly, as though the simple act of her speaking that name had undone something carefully constructed. "You see now why this must remain contained," he said quickly, his voice tightening. "That name carries implications you do not yet understand." Alexander did not turn, his attention remained fixed on her. "Then I will understand them," he replied, and there was no hesitation in the words, only resolve. Eliza felt something shift within her at that response. Not hope, not yet, but the unfamiliar presence of possibility, something she had never allowed herself to consider, because it had never been offered. The older man stepped closer, lowering his voice, as if attempting to confine the conversation once more. "Your Grace, there are histories here, choices made long before your arrival. It is not your place to disrupt them." Alexander's expression remained calm, but there was a subtle change now, something firmer beneath the surface. "History does not excuse what continues in the present," he said, "and this does continue." His words did not accuse loudly. They did not demand, but they left no room for denial. Eliza remained still, though her heartbeat had begun to steady into something stronger, because for the first time, the narrative of her life was no longer being spoken only by others. It was being challenged, and as the candlelight flickered softly against the walls, casting shifting shadows that no longer seemed as heavy as before, the distance between who she had been forced to be and who she might yet become grew smaller, not because anything had been resolved, but because someone had finally refused to accept that she should remain unseen. The name lingered in the air long after it had been spoken, as if the walls themselves struggled to contain it. Eliza Whitmore, no longer just a presence behind a locked door, but something that could not easily be dismissed once acknowledged. Alexander did not repeat it, yet the way his gaze held hers made it clear he had accepted it without question, as though it required no validation beyond her own voice. The older man drew a slow breath, his composure returning in measured layers. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "you must understand that names can carry consequences far beyond intention. Some truths are not meant to be revealed lightly." Alexander turned slightly now, not fully away from Eliza, but enough to acknowledge the man's words. "Then it is fortunate that I do not treat truth as something to be hidden for convenience," he replied, his tone even, though there was a quiet edge beneath it now, something that suggested this was no longer simple curiosity. The man's expression tightened. "You speak as though this is a matter of choice. But it is not. There are reputations tied to this house, alliances, histories that cannot be undone without cost." Eliza remained silent, though her eyes shifted briefly toward the older man, not with resentment, not even with defiance, but with a quiet understanding of the role he played, because he was not the origin of her silence, only its keeper, and that made his certainty both familiar and distant. Alexander studied him for a moment, then spoke with calm precision. "Every decision carries cost. The only difference is whether one chooses to bear it openly or hide it behind silence." The words settled with weight, not loud, but immovable. The older man hesitated, and in that hesitation something fragile revealed itself, not truth, but the fear of it. Eliza stepped forward then, just a single step, enough to close the distance between her and the doorway. Her movement subtle, yet it shifted the entire balance of the room, because she was no longer standing apart from the moment. She was entering it. "You are not obligated to do this," she said quietly, her voice directed to Alexander, not as a plea, but as a statement of fact, something she had learned to accept in every aspect of her life. "Obligations are rarely the reason I act," he replied, his gaze steady. "Then why?" she asked, and for the first time, there was something beneath her composure, not uncertainty, but genuine curiosity, as if she could not quite understand why someone would choose to step into something that had cost her everything. Alexander held her gaze for a moment before answering. "Because I do not ignore what I know to be wrong." The simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any elaborate explanation could have. Eliza felt something shift again within her, not fragile, not fleeting, but steady, like the first moment of balance after standing on unsteady ground for too long. Behind them, the older man straightened, his voice regaining a measure of authority. "This conversation has extended far beyond what is appropriate. Your Grace, it would be wise to conclude it before unnecessary complications arise." Alexander's expression did not change. "The moment has already passed where this could have remained simple," he said, and as the candlelight flickered once more, casting softer shadows across the room that no longer seemed as confining as before, it became clear that whatever had begun here would not end within these walls, because for the first time, Eliza Whitmore had stepped out of silence, and the world beyond would not remain untouched by it. The corridor beyond the room no longer felt distant. It pressed closer now, as though the world that had been kept apart from Eliza for so long had begun to take notice of her presence. Alexander stepped back slightly from the doorway, not to withdraw, but to create space, a silent gesture that invited movement without demanding it. Eliza understood it immediately, though she did not move at once, because stepping forward meant more than crossing a threshold. It meant leaving behind the only place where she had learned to exist without expectation. The older man watched the exchange carefully, his expression tightening as he recognized the shift. "Your Grace," he said firmly, "whatever you believe you have discovered here, it does not change the reality of her position." Alexander's gaze remained steady. "Then explain it," he replied, not as a challenge, but as a requirement. The man hesitated, his silence stretching longer than before, as if the explanation itself resisted being spoken aloud. Eliza drew a slow breath, her hands still at her sides, because she knew what would come next. She had heard fragments of it before, always spoken in lowered tones, always framed as necessity rather than choice. "She is not recognized by this family," the man said at last, his voice measured, controlled. "She was never meant to be part of what this house represents." The words were precise, carefully constructed, yet they carried an emptiness that made them feel less like truth and more like justification. Alexander regarded him without interruption, then asked quietly, "And why is that?" The man's jaw tightened slightly. "Because her existence complicates matters that must remain clear," alliances, inheritances, reputations that depend on certainty. Eliza's gaze did not waver, though something within her settled more firmly, because hearing it spoken so plainly stripped the explanation of its weight, leaving only its intent behind. Alexander turned his attention back to her, and in that moment, the contrast became undeniable, not between two people, but between what had been said about her and what stood before him. There was no uncertainty in her presence, no flaw that justified concealment. Only the quiet strength of someone who had endured being overlooked without surrendering to it. "You have accepted this," he said, not accusing, not questioning her worth, but acknowledging the reality she had lived within. Eliza inclined her head slightly. "Acceptance is not the same as agreement," she replied, her voice calm, though the words carried a depth that had been formed over years. "It is simply what has been required." The simplicity of it held more truth than anything the older man had offered. Alexander absorbed that without comment, though something within his expression shifted, not visibly, but with the subtle certainty of a decision forming. The older man stepped forward again, his tone sharpening as he sensed control slipping further. "Your Grace, this cannot continue. The matter ends here." Alexander looked at him then, fully, his gaze calm, unwavering. "No," he said quietly, "it does not." The words were not forceful, yet they carried a finality that altered the entire space. Eliza felt the weight of them settle into something real, something that extended beyond this room, because for the first time, someone had refused not only to ignore her, but to allow her to be dismissed again. And as the silence returned, it was no longer the silence that had defined her life. It was the silence before everything changed. The finality of his words did not fade. It settled into the corridor like something immovable, something that could not be undone once spoken. And for a moment no one responded, because there was nothing left that could be said without revealing more than had already been intended. Alexander did not raise his voice. He did not step forward with force, yet the space itself seemed to shift around him, as though the balance of authority had quietly, decisively changed. The older man held his composure with visible effort, his hands clasped behind his back as he measured his next words with care. "You misunderstand the nature of what you are disrupting," he said slowly. "This is not a matter that can be corrected by presence alone. There are consequences that extend beyond this house, beyond her, beyond even you." Alexander regarded him with steady calm, then let a brief silence pass before responding. "Consequences do not disappear because they are ignored," he said, "and neither do truths." The statement was simple, but it carried a weight that stripped away the careful structure of the man's argument. Eliza stood just inside the doorway now, the light from the corridor reaching her fully for the first time, and though nothing about her had changed, everything felt different, because she was no longer framed by shadows, no longer defined by absence. The older man exhaled slowly, his patience thinning into something sharper. "Your Grace, you are a guest here," he said, emphasizing the word as if it might restore order. "There are boundaries that should be respected." Alexander's expression remained composed, yet there was a quiet shift beneath it, not anger, not irritation, but a firm refusal to be redirected. "Respect is not given to silence that conceals injustice," he replied, his voice even, "and I do not recognize boundaries that exist solely to erase someone." The words settled into the space with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. Eliza felt them more than heard them, not because they were loud, but because they aligned with something she had never been allowed to name. The older man's gaze flickered briefly toward her, then back to Alexander, as if weighing whether to continue resisting or to change approach. "You believe this is a simple matter of right and wrong," he said, "but it is not. Her presence here was decided long before either of you had any say in it." Alexander did not look away. "Then it can be decided differently now," he said, and there was no hesitation in the statement, no uncertainty, only the quiet certainty of someone who had already made his decision. Eliza's breath slowed, her posture unchanged, though something within her steadied, because this was no longer a moment that could be dismissed as curiosity or passing interest. It had become something deliberate, something that would carry forward beyond this corridor. The older man straightened once more, his voice lowering, controlled but edged with warning. "If you proceed, you will not be able to withdraw." without consequence. Your alliances here will be affected. Your position may be questioned. Alexander regarded him without reaction, then spoke with calm finality. I do not measure my decisions by how easily I can retreat from them. The silence that followed was absolute, not empty, but full, as though every unspoken truth within the house had risen to the surface at once. Eliza remained where she stood, no longer hidden, no longer separate, and for the first time, the world beyond her door did not feel like something she would merely observe, but something she would step into. And as the candlelight flickered softly against the walls, it became clear that whatever came next would not be contained within quiet conversations or closed doors, because the moment of silence had ended, and something far greater had begun. The silence did not break with argument. It broke with movement, subtle at first, then undeniable. Alexander stepped back from the doorway and turned toward the corridor, not as one who withdraws, but as one who has already decided the direction forward. Eliza understood it without words, though her feet remained still for a moment longer, because leaving that room was not simply walking into a hallway. It was stepping into a world that had refused her existence for years, and yet the door behind her was no longer closed, no longer locked, and that alone changed everything. You intend to take this beyond these walls, the older man said, his voice quieter now, stripped of authority and edged instead with realization. Alexander paused, then answered without turning. I intend to stop pretending it belongs within them. The words settled with quiet certainty, and, for the first time, there was no attempt to disguise what was about to happen. Eliza drew a slow breath, her fingers relaxing at her sides, because the moment had arrived whether she had prepared for it or not. She stepped forward, one measured step, then another, until she crossed the threshold completely. The movement simple, yet it carried the weight of years, and as she entered the corridor fully, the space seemed to shift around her. No longer something she observed from behind a barrier, but something she now occupied. The servant standing nearby lowered his gaze instinctively, not in dismissal, but in something closer to uncertainty, as if he did not know how to look at her now that she was no longer hidden. The older man's composure faltered for the briefest second, his attention fixed on her as though witnessing something that should not have been allowed. You do not understand what this will bring upon you, he said, his voice directed at her now, not Alexander. Eliza met his gaze calmly, then answered with quiet clarity. I have lived with what it has already brought. The response was not defiant, not emotional. It was simply true, and that truth carried more weight than any warning could. Alexander glanced toward her then, not to guide, not to command, but to acknowledge, and in that brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, not assurance, not promise, but recognition that whatever came next would be faced in the open, not hidden behind closed doors. The older man exhaled slowly, his resistance no longer sharp, but strained, as though the effort to maintain control had begun to exceed what was possible. This cannot be undone, he said quietly, almost to himself. Alexander turned fully now, his gaze steady. Some things are not meant to remain undone, he replied, and with that, the last illusion of containment fell away. Footsteps echoed faintly from the far end of the corridor, distant voices carrying from the lower halls, reminders that the world beyond this moment continued unaware of what was about to change. Eliza stood still for a brief second longer, allowing the reality of her position to settle, then lifted her chin slightly, her posture steady, because if she was to step into that world, she would not do so as something uncertain. She would do so as herself. And as Alexander began to walk, not waiting, not looking back, but moving forward with quiet purpose, she followed, not behind, but beside, and with each step, the distance between silence and recognition grew smaller, until it no longer existed at all. The grand staircase rose before them like a boundary between two worlds, one built on polished appearances and whispered agreements, the other on truths long buried beneath them. And as Alexander descended with steady, unhurried steps, the sound of his movement carried ahead, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Conversations in the lower hall began to falter, laughter softened. The delicate rhythm of music from the adjoining salon hesitated, as though the house itself sensed a shift it could not contain. Eliza walked beside him, her posture composed, her gaze forward, though each step brought her closer to a space she had only ever known through distant echoes. The marble floor stretched wide beneath the glow of chandeliers, their light reflecting off polished surfaces that had never once been meant for her. Yet she did not hesitate, because hesitation would have meant returning to what she had already left behind. At the base of the staircase, the first of the guests turned, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to something sharper, more questioning, as they recognized the Duke, and then, gradually, the presence beside him, a woman unfamiliar, yet carrying herself with a quiet certainty that did not align with any place they could assign to her. Whispers began, soft, uncertain, spreading in careful ripples through the room. The host of the estate appeared from the far side, his expression composed but strained, moving quickly as if to intercept what could still be contained. "Your Grace," he said, his tone measured, though it carried a thread of urgency. "This is not the appropriate setting for private matters." Alexander did not slow, his gaze steady as he stepped fully into the center of the hall. "There is nothing private about what has been made visible," he replied, his voice calm, yet carrying clearly through the room without the need to rise. The murmurs deepened, attention sharpening, every eye drawn now not only to him, but to her. Eliza felt it, the weight of being seen by those who had never known she existed. Yet her expression did not change. Her chin remained lifted, her composure unbroken, because she would not allow their uncertainty to define her. The host stepped closer, lowering his voice as if hoping proximity might restore control. "You risk more than your own standing by doing this," he said quietly. "Think carefully before you proceed." Alexander regarded him without reaction, then spoke with measured clarity. "I have considered it, and I proceed regardless." The simplicity of the statement carried more force than any raised declaration could have. Silence fell more fully now, not complete, but heavy, expectant, as though the room itself waited for what would come next. Eliza stood beside him, no longer hidden, no longer separate, and, for the first time, the world she had been denied was forced to acknowledge her presence, not because she demanded it, but because it could no longer be denied. And as the light from the chandeliers settled around her, illuminating what had once been kept in shadow, it became clear that whatever this moment would cost, it had already changed everything. The silence that followed was not uncertain, it was complete, as though the entire room had drawn a single breath and forgotten how to release it. Every gaze fixed upon the space where truth had finally stepped into the light. Alexander stood without movement, his presence steady, unyielding, not demanding attention, yet holding it without effort. And beside him, Eliza did not shift, did not falter beneath the weight of being seen, because she had already endured something far heavier than judgment. The host's composure broke in small, almost imperceptible ways, his hand tightening at his side, his carefully measured calm slipping into something strained. "You leave us no choice but to address this openly," he said, his voice controlled but thinner now, the words carrying not authority, but the realization that control had been lost. Alexander inclined his head slightly. "Then address it," he replied, his tone even, neither confrontational nor yielding, simply certain. The murmurs in the room began to rise again, no longer hushed, but threaded with speculation, with curiosity sharpened by the undeniable presence of something long concealed. The host exhaled slowly, then spoke with deliberate clarity. "This woman," he began, his gaze flickering toward Eliza as if the acknowledgement itself was an effort, "was never intended to be part of this house's public standing. Her existence was complicated." The word hung in the air, insufficient and fragile. Eliza did not react, because she had heard variations of it all her life. But now, spoken before others, it seemed smaller, less powerful than it had ever felt before. Alexander's gaze remained steady. "Then perhaps it is time her existence is defined by something other than avoidance," he said, and the quiet weight of the statement settled across the room, stripping the explanation of its distance. The host's expression tightened. "You presume too much," he replied, though the certainty in his tone had weakened. Alexander did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward Eliza, not to place her forward, not to display her, but to stand fully beside her. A gesture so simple, yet so deliberate that it altered the meaning of the moment entirely. "No," he said at last. I recognize what is already clear, and he did not elaborate, because he did not need to. The room had already seen it, the composure, the quiet strength, the undeniable presence that could not be dismissed as something unworthy of acknowledgement. Eliza felt the weight of that moment settle into. Something steady, not overwhelming, not fragile, but firm, because for the first time, she was not being explained, she was being witnessed. The host's gaze shifted between them, calculation giving way to something more uncertain, because the narrative he had relied upon no longer held its shape under scrutiny. And in that uncertainty, the balance of power shifted entirely. The chandeliers above cast a steady glow, no longer highlighting differences, but revealing them, and what they revealed could not be undone. Eliza Whitmore stood not as something hidden, not as something to be excused or concealed, but simply as herself, and that was enough to change everything. Alexander remained beside her, his presence not shielding, not controlling, but standing with quiet certainty. And as the murmurs continued, as the room adjusted to a reality it could no longer ignore, it became clear that the moment had passed beyond return, because once something long hidden has been seen, it cannot be unseen. And in that undeniable truth, something greater than scandal or reputation took shape, something far quieter, far stronger, the beginning of a life no longer defined by silence. Because some hearts are not meant to remain in the shadows, and once brought into the light, they do not fade, they endure.